Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to show you the birds that I was able to photograph during a recent trip to Colorado in June. Now this was a work trip. I was there for a conference that I was attending at the University of Colorado at Boulder, but did have plenty of time to go birding in the evenings and also on the weekend following the end of the conference. What I didn't do in this trip is photograph myself talking from any of these locations. I was with other people the whole time, and like most people, I do find it awkward to record myself talking while I'm in front of other people. So I'm going to do this video in voiceover. But having said that, I did have good luck with the photography on this trip, both birds and also a lot of neat mammals as well. So hope you'll enjoy seeing what I saw on this trip. So let's go ahead and get into it. So just to set the scene for this video, as I know not all of my viewers are necessarily familiar with U.S. geography, Boulder's a small city just north of Denver that's located right at the base of the Rocky Mountains. Boulder's actually a good home base for a birding trip because you can easily access both flat plains locations to the east or drive up into higher elevations to the west. And of course, more habitats means more birds. On the first afternoon after arriving, my wife and I went for a quick walk at a location near our hotel and picked up just a few birds, including this western meadowlark. I'm always struck by how common western meadowlarks are in the west, whereas back home in Massachusetts it seems that eastern meadowlarks are pretty much going extinct as far as I can tell. Then in the evening we went to a nice location up on a mesa just west of Boulder where the National Center for Atmospheric Research, or Encar, is located. This was a really great spot, and we ended up returning here a few times, so I'll just combine the bird sightings from the different visits. There's a large parking lot up on the mesa that's always pretty empty, and there's good birding and views found just by walking around the edge of the parking lot. For example, these Brewer's blackbirds were hanging out right in the parking lot. I also found some pygmy nuthatches in the trees next to the parking area. This one was quite cooperative and noisy. Just as a reminder, the number in the lower right corner of the screen indicates that this is a new bird for the channel life list, which represents all the bird species I've shown well in these videos since starting the channel last year. Picked up quite a few of these channel lifers on this trip, as you'll see. Pygmy nuthatch is a tiny bird, but it has a surprisingly large and sturdy bill. That's me looking for birds as always, and you can see part of the Encar building there to the right. Here's a better view of the building, known as the Mesa Laboratory. It was built back in the 1960s, and as you can see it has quite a futuristic design. In fact, it's actually been featured in a few science fiction movies over the years. It was designed by the famous architect I.M. Pei fairly early in his career. He's probably best known for designing the glass pyramid that covers the Louvre Museum in Paris. There's a nice exhibit inside the Mesa Laboratory that explains the history of the building. Getting back to the birds, Steller's jay is a common bird of the western U.S. I had to follow this one around for a while before I was able to get some decent photos. Here's a black-billed magpie, a relatively common bird in the western United States that's closely related to the familiar Eurasian magpie that can be seen in urban parks all over Europe. Here's an example of the great views from the Encar Mesa. Violet green swallows are very common in the Boulder area. They're closely related to tree swallows, but are even more colorful. On my last visit to the Encar Mesa, I found one perched up and got some decent photos. While walking on one of the trails up on the mesa, I briefly spotted a pair of lazuli buntings and got a few photos of the female. Wish I'd gotten some photos of the male, as it's a beautiful shade of blue. And finally, I managed to get just one photo of a western bluebird, also right next to the parking lot. The next location that we visited was called Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge, which is located on the flat grass plains just east of Denver. This location has an interesting and somewhat ominous history, as it was used to manufacture chemical weapons during World War II and throughout the Cold War. Fortunately, these chemical weapons were never used, and the facility was cleaned up and turned into a national wildlife refuge in the 1980s. It's a really nice place to see birds and mammals that are native to the Great Plains, which are viewed from an 11-mile auto loop. Probably the most famous residents here are a herd of bison that were imported from Montana. This one was hanging out fairly close to the road, while the main herd was off in the distance. As you can imagine, you're encouraged not to stray too far from your car here.
Whether for sport, food, or in efforts to deprive native cultures of their livelihood, settlers and market hunters killed bison at numbers almost unimaginable today. With some
Here's another western meadowlark, which is singing its pretty song. There was a plane going over, unfortunately, but you can hear it pretty well. Lark sparrows are pretty common, and it was nice to find this one perched on a wire fence. These are quite uncommon in Massachusetts, but I did pick one up this year way back in early January. This American kestrel was hanging out on some solar panels near the visitor center. There are a few ponds on the site which held some nice water birds, including this one white pelican. It's amazing how large these pelicans are. I was surprised to see a redhead as well. I didn't realize they might be around in the summertime. This pied-billed grebe was a more expected species, as was this snowy egret. Here's a Say's phoebe, which was also hanging out next to one of the ponds. Lark buntings are a specialty bird of grassland prairies, and they were one of the most common birds along the auto loop. The males are very distinctive with their contrasting black and white plumage. The females are much more drab and would be a tough ID if no males were around. Keeping up the lark theme, horned larks were fairly common along the edges of the road as we drove around the auto loop. In Massachusetts, I only see these in the wintertime. Another fun mammal species that we saw is the prairie dog. They've set up their towns all over the place here, and we spent a little time just watching them frolic around. As we were finishing the auto loop, we passed a little wet area that was basically just a puddle, but it had some interesting birds. One of them was this cattle egret, which was in the process of catching and eating a mouse. At one point it dropped the mouse, but was able to recapture it before it could escape. There were also a couple of American avocets in the same puddle. These are really elegant shorebirds, and I definitely want to get some better photos and video for the channel sometime in the future. Another interesting location that we visited was Rocky Mountain National Park. This is a very famous and popular location. In fact, you have to register ahead of time to enter unless you plan to arrive early in the morning or later in the afternoon. We weren't able to register or get there early, so we arrived around 3 p.m. This only left us a short time in the park, but we still saw a lot of cool wildlife. Elk and mule deer were both quite common as we drove around the park. These can be tricky to separate as they're fairly similar in their appearance. This one here is an elk. And these ones are mule deer. Mule deer have white faces and very long ears, which is where they get their name. Here's another elk. The darker color of the neck compared to the body is a good field mark for an elk. We wanted to see some of the high elevation views that the park is famous for, so we drove up toward the Alpine Visitor Center, which is at an altitude of 12,000 feet or 3,600 meters. However, we realized along the way that we would not get there before it closed. So we pulled off at a scenic overlook called Rainbow Curve, which had a really breathtaking view. As soon as we got out of the car, I started hearing a bird call that I didn't recognize, which turned out to be a group of Clark's Nutcrackers. This was my only lifer of the trip, and one I was hoping but not expecting to see, so I was pretty excited. As you see, these nutcrackers were not at all shy, and I suspect they might have even taken some nuts out of my hand, but I didn't try it.
Come on. Come on.
There were also plenty of little rodents scurrying around looking for handouts, and I was able to identify 2 of them.
Come on.
After this nice stop, we headed back out of the park as we were running out of daylight, but along the way we made a stop at a lower altitude location that had been recommended to us by a park ranger. I was really glad that we did because we ended up at a very peaceful and uncrowded picnic area that had some nice birds. A green-tailed towhee was singing on top of a tree. And I was also able to grab some shots of this broad-tailed hummingbird when it landed briefly. You always know when they're around because the males make a loud, high-pitched ringing sound with their wings that's quite different from other hummingbirds. I was excited to spot this mountain bluebird. The blue color really popped in the late afternoon light. I think this was only the second time I've ever seen this species. And just when we were about to leave, I heard a western tanager in a tree right next to the car. The light was getting low due to some clouds rolling in, but I was able to get some decent shots of this spectacular bird. Overall, our 5-hour visit to Rocky Mountain National Park was much too short, and I really want to come back for a longer visit and do some hiking. One final location that we visited was Bar Lake State Park, just outside of Denver, which was not as interesting or attractive as the other locations I visited, but I did pick up some birds. I had seen Bullock's orioles a few times already, but this was the best sighting by far. In fact, this photo here is one of my favorites from the trip. I also got a shot of this western wood pewee, which looks just like an eastern wood pewee, It has a somewhat different song. Western kingbirds were also common throughout this trip, but this was the first chance I had to get some decent photos. I also saw a western kingbird and an eastern kingbird getting into a fight, which I thought was kind of funny. No clear winner to report, and it was all over before I could take any pictures. Okay, that wraps up my trip to Colorado. Once again, sorry I didn't film myself talking from any of the locations that I visited on this trip. So I'll be back soon with another video from my 2025 birding challenge from Massachusetts. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.